Lena Royster had made exactly 3 good decisions in her 29 years. Opening her interior design firm with her own capital at 24, refusing to marry the safe man her father wanted for her at 26, and walking away from the only relationship that felt close to real when she realized it was built on lies at 28. Standing in the lobby of the charity gala while Dylan Bernard's eyes tracked her across the room might not be the 4th. She didn't know it yet, but it would become the most consequential decision of her life. Not because Dylan was looking at her, but because unlike every other woman in that ballroom who'd felt his gaze and turned toward it like flowers to the sun, Lena felt it and deliberately turned away. Lena stood at the entrance to the Chicago Metropolitan Charity Gala, her colleague Marcus beside her, making nervous comments about how much his ex-wife would hate seeing him here with such an elegant woman. Lena wasn't elegant because she was trying to be. She was elegant because she didn't care about being anything else. She wore a simple black dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, not because she needed anyone to know she had money, but because the cut was perfect and precision was the only language she spoke fluently. The ballroom was exactly what Lena expected and nothing like she wanted to experience. Crystal chandeliers cast light across a room full of Chicago's wealthy, all of them orbiting power the way planets orbit the sun. Lena found herself critiquing the venue's design choices before she'd even set down her clutch. The color palette was dated. The spacing of the tables was inefficient. The flowers arranged on each centerpiece had been chosen by someone with no understanding of negative space. She mentioned this to the server offering champagne, and he looked at her the way people always did when she pointed out problems nobody else had noticed. Like she was both brilliant and exhausting. That's when she felt it. Eyes on her. Not the casual assessment of someone noticing a beautiful woman in a beautiful dress. This was different. This was the focused attention of a predator identifying prey. Lena didn't turn around immediately. She finished her sentence to the server about how the venue's bones were good but the vision was lazy. Only then did she allow herself to glance over her shoulder. The man watching her from across the ballroom was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Not because he was handsome, though he was. Not because he carried himself with authority, though he did. But because when their eyes met, something in his expression shifted. A hunter who'd spotted something he didn't expect to find. Something that didn't immediately submit. Dylan Bernard had never seen a woman ignore him before. And he'd never wanted one as badly as he wanted this one. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now because what happens next will destroy both of them in ways they never expected. This is a story about manipulation, redemption, and the choice to love someone despite knowing exactly what they're capable of. You won't want to miss a single moment. Subscribe and let's dive deeper. Dylan found her 3 days after the gala through a contact who specialized in finding people. Her name was Lena Royster. She owned an interior design firm in Chicago called Royster Designs. She lived alone in a loft in the West Loop. She had no social media presence, which meant she either didn't care about appearing in the world or was intentionally invisible. Dylan suspected both. He stood outside her office building on a Wednesday afternoon and watched her through the glass doors. She was arguing with a contractor about the quality of marble he'd sourced. Her words were precise, cutting, delivered without anger. Just fact. The contractor looked like he wanted to cry. Dylan felt something shift in his chest that felt dangerously close to respect. He sent flowers first. Expensive ones. White roses because they felt honest. No card. Just the flowers delivered to her office. She threw them away. He found out because he had someone watching. The next week he sent books instead. Rare first editions on architecture and design. She kept those. He knew because the same person told him she'd reorganized her office shelves to display them. When Dylan finally approached her in person, he didn't use his name or his power. He approached her at a coffee shop near her office on a Friday morning when she was alone, reading a book about the structural integrity of concrete. He ordered coffee and sat at the table next to hers. He waited until she looked up, which took 20 minutes. When she did, there was no recognition in her eyes. No awareness that she was looking at the most dangerous man in Chicago. She just saw someone reading over her shoulder. "I think your assessment of that building's load capacity is wrong," he said quietly. She closed her book and studied him with an expression that suggested she was deciding whether he was worth her time. "Most people don't understand structural engineering," she said. "They understand money. Those aren't the same thing." He smiled. "Exactly. That's why most buildings are failures disguised as success." He took her to dinner that night. Not to a restaurant where he was known. To a small place where they served food cooked by an old woman who'd known his mother. He told Lena about learning to cook from his grandmother, about the way she'd taught him that patience was the only ingredient that mattered. He didn't mention the empire. He didn't mention the territories he controlled or the families that answered to him. He talked about books he loved. About architects who understood that beauty and function weren't separate things. About his dream to build something that would last beyond his lifetime. Lena listened. She asked questions. She challenged his ideas. When he said that most buildings lacked honesty, she asked him what he meant. He told her that buildings, like people, could be designed to deceive. Beautiful on the outside, hollow within. She nodded like she understood exactly what he meant, and the terrifying thing was that she did. 3 weeks of dinners and conversations became the architecture of Dylan's obsession. He would say something about Lena and his lieutenant would nod and file it away. But the truth was that Dylan wasn't performing anymore. When he talked about wanting to build things that lasted, he was thinking about her. When he spoke about honesty, he was measuring the distance between what he was and what he wanted to be. On the 21st night, Dylan took Lena to his penthouse. The city spread below them like a kingdom he'd conquered but never wanted. He poured wine and asked her to stay. "Just this once," he said. "Just the night." Lena looked at the skyline and at Dylan, and she made a decision that would crack open her carefully constructed world. "Yes," she said. And when she did, Dylan felt like he'd finally built something real. The penthouse was exactly what Lena expected from Dylan Bernard and nothing like what she wanted to admit she'd imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, offering a view of Chicago that made the city look like something he'd designed himself. The furniture was minimal but expensive, chosen by someone with taste and restraint. Everything was in its place. Everything was controlled. It felt like the interior of his mind made physical. Dylan poured wine and they stood at the window, not speaking, just existing in the space between what they were and what they might become. The city lights reflected in the glass, and Lena could see both of them superimposed over the skyline. Two people standing on top of the world with no one below to catch them if they fell. He touched her face first. Not her body. Her face. His hand moved across her cheek like he was trying to memorize the geography of her, like she was architecture he needed to understand before he could build something on top of her. When he kissed her, it wasn't the kiss of a man who'd conquered. It was the kiss of a man surrendering. In the bedroom, Dylan moved slowly. Carefully. Like Lena was something precious that required precision. He undressed her with the focus of someone unwrapping something they'd waited their entire life to open. When he entered her, it felt less like passion and more like communion. Like two people who'd been broken separately were fitting back together into something whole. Afterward, they lay tangled in his expensive sheets, and Lena did something she'd never done before. She told the truth. All of it. She told him about her mother. How she'd woken up one morning when Lena was 16 and just stopped breathing. No warning. No goodbye. Just gone. She told him about the years after, about learning to be independent because dependence meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant death. She told him about building her design firm brick by brick, about the way she controlled every detail because control was the only thing that kept her from drowning. She told him about the walls she'd constructed so carefully that she'd forgotten there was anything outside them. Dylan listened. He held her. His hand moved through her hair like he was soothing a wounded thing. When she finished speaking, when there was nothing left but the raw truth of her, he pulled her closer. "You're safe now," he said into her hair. "Nothing will ever hurt you again. I'll make sure of it. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you're protected." Lena believed him. In that moment, suspended between the city below and the sky above, she believed every word. She believed that this man, this dangerous man, this man who controlled empires, was telling her the truth. She believed that she'd finally found someone who could hold her weight. That she could stop being strong all the time. That someone else could be strong for her. She allowed herself to imagine it. A future where she wasn't alone. Where she woke up to Dylan's face every morning. Where she could design beautiful spaces knowing that someone loved her enough to fill those spaces with his presence. Where she didn't have to carry everything by herself anymore. When dawn broke over Chicago, Lena woke to find Dylan already gone. A note on the pillow said he had a meeting. He'd be back by evening. She should make herself comfortable. But Lena didn't feel abandoned. She felt like she'd been left in a sacred space. She moved through the penthouse like she belonged there, admiring the way morning light fell through the windows. She noticed the bones of the space, the way it was structured. It was beautiful but incomplete. It needed warmth. It needed the kind of intentional design that made a place feel like a home instead of a showroom. She walked to the windows and looked out at Chicago spreading below her. For the first time since her mother died, Lena felt the walls around her heart crack open. She thought about bringing color into this space. About filling it with things that mattered. About building something with Dylan that would last. She didn't know yet that she was designing the prison that would hold her. 3 weeks into living in Dylan's penthouse, Lena stopped thinking about leaving. She stopped measuring her life in the before and after of meeting him. She existed instead in a present tense that felt infinite, like time had reorganized itself around the two of them and nothing outside that circle mattered anymore. Dylan introduced her to his family on a Sunday. His brother Marcus was nothing like she expected. Warm. Funny. A restaurateur who actually seemed to care about sourcing ingredients ethically instead of just profitably. His sister Catherine ran a legitimate real estate development company. His mother Elena, who still lived in the family home near Millennium Park, looked at Lena with an expression that suggested she was taking inventory of everything Lena was and calculating whether she was adequate for her son. Dylan's hand never left the small of Lena's back that entire afternoon. It was possessive in a way that should have frightened her but instead felt like belonging. The private dinners came next. Lena would dress in clothes Dylan selected for her, and they'd go to restaurants that seemed to exist behind unmarked doors. Men in expensive suits would nod at Dylan with deference. Women would watch Lena with an expression somewhere between curiosity and pity. She didn't understand the pity yet. At these dinners, Dylan would ask her questions. Casual ones. About conversations she'd overheard. About who was talking to whom. About what people said when they thought no one important was listening. He framed it as genuine interest in her observations about human behavior. Lena had always been perceptive. Design required it. She could look at a space and understand what the person who built it was trying to say about themselves. So when Dylan asked her what she'd noticed about the Marino family at the charity benefit last week, she told him. She'd overheard them discussing warehouse operations. She'd noticed the way they moved through the crowd like they owned it. She'd observed the careful distance they maintained from Dylan's circle. Lena reported it like she was offering him insight into the architecture of power. Dylan listened. He kissed her forehead. He told her she was brilliant. But there were small moments. Moments where Lena's instinct for design and structure picked up on something off. The way Dylan would ask about specific people in her professional circles. The subtle shift in his tone when she mentioned a client who had connections to the Marino organization. The fact that he'd somehow encouraged her to attend events where she normally wouldn't have gone, using gentle persuasion, and the way she couldn't deny him anything anymore. One afternoon, Lena went to Dylan's office to retrieve her phone. She'd left it there the night before while they made love on his desk, which had felt dangerous and thrilling at the time. Now it just felt reckless. She was halfway to the desk when she heard voices from behind the closed door to the inner office. Dylan's voice. And another man's. Marcus? No. Not his brother. Someone else. His lieutenant, maybe. Lena should have left. She should have called out and announced her presence. Instead, she stopped. She heard Dylan say her name. Lena has been incredibly useful. The voice was clinical. Professional. Like they were discussing a business asset instead of a person. She moves in circles we don't. People talk around her because they underestimate her. She's brought us everything we needed on the Merino operation. Lena's hand moved to her chest. Her heart was doing something strange. Something that felt like breaking. Once we secure the deal, Dylan said, we'll retire her from that role. She won't be needed anymore. The words were exactly the same temperature as the office. Cold. Calculated. They contained no warmth, no affection, no acknowledgement of anything that had happened between them. Lena understood, in that moment, with absolute clarity, that she had been designed. Not chosen. Not loved. But systematically, carefully constructed into a tool. Every dinner. Every story about his childhood. Every promise whispered against her skin in the darkness. It had all been architecture. Blueprints for a woman he needed to become. She didn't retrieve her phone. She turned and walked back down the hallway on feet that felt like they belonged to someone else. She moved through the penthouse like a ghost moving through the place where she'd died. She found her purse. She found her shoes. She found herself in the elevator, watching the numbers count down like they were measuring her descent into understanding. The streets of Chicago felt different when she emerged from the building. Louder. Colder. More real. She hailed a cab and gave her address, not the penthouse address Dylan had programmed into her life, but her old apartment. The one she'd maintained even while she was surrendering to him. Some small part of her, the part that had survived her mother's death, had refused to fully disappear. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Controlled. Minimal. A space designed by someone who'd learned that attachment was dangerous. She sat in the darkness and didn't turn on the lights. She didn't cry. Tears would have required feeling something, and right now all she felt was the hollow recognition of her own stupidity. She'd opened herself completely to Dylan Bernard. She'd told him about her mother. She'd let him touch her in ways she'd never let anyone else touch her. She'd allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve walls or distance or the careful construction of self-protection. And he'd used every single moment of her vulnerability like it was intelligence for a war. Lena sat in the dark and understood, with the precision that had made her a brilliant designer, exactly how thoroughly she had been deceived. Dylan knew something was wrong the moment he returned to the penthouse and Lena wasn't there. Not in the bedroom. Not at the windows. Not in the kitchen with coffee brewing like she'd started doing every morning, like she was building a domestic life inside his carefully controlled space. Her purse was gone. Her shoes were gone. The only thing she'd left behind was the echo of her absence. He made calls. By the time he reached her apartment building, he already knew where she was. His people had tracked her cab. They'd followed her movements through the city like she was a piece on a chessboard he needed to keep in sight. It had become a habit, this monitoring. A way of maintaining control over something that had started to feel uncontrollable. He didn't call first. He went directly to her door and found it unlocked, which meant she'd left it that way deliberately. A message. An invitation or a threat, he wasn't sure which. The apartment was dark. Lena sat on her couch like a sculpture of herself, silhouetted against the window. She didn't turn when he entered. Didn't acknowledge his presence. Just sat there in the darkness like she was waiting for something to break inside her. Dylan knew immediately that she knew. He moved toward her carefully, the way you'd approach an animal that had been cornered. I can explain, he started, and the words felt wrong the moment they left his mouth. Explanations were what he did when he was trying to manipulate. When he was trying to reframe reality into something more palatable. Lena finally turned to look at him. Her expression was worse than anger. It was the complete absence of emotion. Like she'd constructed walls so quickly that there was nothing left of the woman he'd known. Nothing left of the woman who'd opened herself to him. "You were using me," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A fact she'd already processed and filed away. Dylan's first instinct was to lie. To minimize. To tell her she'd misunderstood. To say that he was discussing something else, someone else, and she'd misheard. He was good at lies. Lies were the language he spoke fluently. But looking at Lena's face, at the complete devastation and clarity in her eyes, he couldn't. He couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. Not when she was already gone. "Yes," he said quietly. "Initially. That's true." The words hung in the space between them like poison. "I pursued you because you had access to circles we didn't. People talk around you because they underestimate you. You were useful." Dylan watched her absorb this, watched the way her face didn't change even though her entire world was collapsing. But Lena, somewhere along the way, that changed. "I changed. Everything I've told you about my childhood, about wanting to build things that last, about the way you make me want to be different. That was real. That is real." She laughed. It was the worst sound he'd ever heard. A sound without joy or humor. A sound of complete understanding and absolute rejection. "You're a liar," she said. "That's what you do. You construct narratives. You build things designed to make people believe what you want them to believe. And I was so desperate to believe you that I let you. I let you design me into someone you could use." Dylan moved closer and she held up her hand. "Don't," she said, and the word contained every warning she'd ever given herself about him that she'd chosen to ignore. "I love you," Dylan said. It sounded inadequate the moment he said it. Love was a word he'd learned to weaponize. A word he'd used to manipulate people into surrendering their autonomy. But he meant it. The terror in his chest right now, the way his carefully constructed world was fracturing because she was leaving, meant it. "You love what I represented," Lena said. "You love that I was smart enough to move in useful circles. You love that I was vulnerable enough to open myself completely to you. You love that you were able to construct a narrative that turned me from a person into a pawn. That's not love. That's ownership disguised as affection." Lena stood up. She walked to the door and opened it, a clear dismissal. "I want you to leave. And I don't ever want to see you again." Dylan didn't move. He stood there in her dark apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a woman who'd learned to protect herself from people like him. A woman he'd broken despite swearing he'd keep her safe. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that this is real," he said. "I'll spend the rest of my life earning your forgiveness, earning your trust, becoming the man you deserve." Lena's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened further. You can't prove something was real by lying about how it started. And you can't become a different man by asking the person you destroyed to believe in you while you're still using her as leverage. That's not redemption. That's just a more sophisticated version of the same manipulation. She walked to the door and held it open. "Goodbye, Dylan." He moved toward her like he was walking through water. Every step felt heavy. Every moment felt like it might be his last. At the threshold, he stopped. He wanted to touch her. He wanted to hold her. He wanted to rewrite this moment so that it ended differently. But he'd already rewritten enough of her life. "I love you," he said one more time, knowing it wouldn't change anything. Knowing that words were all he had left and they were all completely insufficient. Lena didn't respond. She just closed the door quietly, without the drama of a slam. The quiet was worse. The quiet was the sound of something ending. Dylan stood in the hallway of her apartment building and understood, with absolute clarity, that he'd lost the only thing he'd ever actually wanted to keep. And he'd lost it by building his life on a foundation of lies so deep that the truth would never be able to reach her again. 2 weeks was 14 days was 336 hours of Lena moving through her apartment like a ghost haunting the space where she used to live. She threw herself into work with the kind of intensity that bordered on self-destruction. She took on projects she normally would have rejected. A downtown loft that needed a complete redesign. A corporate office that required her to make sterile spaces feel human. A restaurant renovation that demanded she think about how people moved through rooms and what they felt when they did. The work kept her hands busy. It kept her mind occupied. It kept her from thinking about Dylan's hands on her face or the way he'd whispered promises against her skin or the absolute devastation of realizing that every moment had been carefully orchestrated. She redesigned her apartment methodically. Every piece of furniture that reminded her of him, she replaced. The couch where they'd sat wrapped around each other while he told her about architecture and beauty, gone. The kitchen where he'd made her coffee that first morning, reconfigured. She painted the walls a color that had nothing to do with anything he'd ever said about her. A sharp, aggressive gray that felt like armor. She blocked his number. When he showed up at her door 3 times in the first week, she didn't answer. She watched the security footage on her phone and saw him standing there with an expression of desperation that almost broke her resolve. Almost. But Lena had learned at 16 that almost wasn't enough. Almost didn't keep you alive. She attended a gallery opening on the second Friday because she needed to pretend that her life was still happening. That she was still the woman who cared about art and design and the intersection of beauty and function. She was standing in front of a photograph of abandoned architecture when someone touched her arm. It was Catherine. Dylan's sister. Catherine looked genuinely happy to see her until she got close enough to see Lena's face. Then something in her expression shifted. Recognition. Understanding. The dawning awareness that something had broken. Lena, how are you? Catherine's voice was careful, the way you'd speak to someone you suspected was fragile. Lena turned away from the photograph. Fine, she said flatly. Everything's fine. Catherine studied her with an expression that reminded her painfully of Dylan. The same dark eyes. The same intensity. She reached out and touched Lena's arm again. He's destroyed, you know. He won't eat. He's barely sleeping. He took a leave of absence from the business. He just sits in his office staring at nothing. Lena felt something crack inside her chest. She didn't want to know this. She didn't want to know that Dylan was suffering. Suffering implied that he cared. Suffering implied that maybe, just maybe, some small part of what he'd said was true. I don't care, Lena said, and the lie was so complete that even she almost believed it. But Catherine saw through it. Catherine had watched her brother manipulate people her entire life, and she recognized the same mechanics happening now. The same careful construction of narrative. The same way of building walls instead of bridges. He loves you, Catherine said quietly. People like Dylan don't love, Lena responded. They consume. They use. They construct elaborate fantasies where they're the hero of someone else's story. That's not love. That's predation wearing a pretty face. Catherine's expression hardened. You're right. That sounds like my brother. But you should know that he's trying to change. He's actually trying. For the first time in his life, he's stepping back from the business. He's trying to become someone different. Lena turned back to the photograph. She couldn't look at Catherine anymore. The resemblance to Dylan was too painful. It's too late, she said. Some things can't be rebuilt once they're broken. Word got back to Dylan through Catherine, though he suspected she was being merciful. She probably told him that Lena was fine, was moving forward, was clearly ready to move on. The truth, which Dylan pieced together through other channels, was that Lena was a shadow of herself. That she'd withdrawn from the social circles where she used to move. That people who knew her were concerned. That she'd lost weight and was throwing herself into work like she was trying to outrun something. Dylan hated what he'd done to her. He hated it with an intensity that consumed him. He'd built an empire on the ability to compartmentalize pain, to push emotion aside and focus on strategy. But he couldn't compartmentalize this. Couldn't push aside the knowledge that he'd taken a woman who'd already been broken by loss and shattered her in ways she might never recover from. He made a decision that felt like losing everything while losing nothing. He stopped trying to contact her. He removed the security detail he'd had watching her apartment. He stopped having people report back on her whereabouts. He deleted the design sketches Lena had made for his penthouse from his files. He dismantled the architecture of his obsession brick by brick, knowing that the only way to truly love her was to let her go completely. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum after that. Rooms full of expensive furniture and empty of meaning. He stood at the windows overlooking Chicago and didn't feel the satisfaction of empire that he'd felt before. He felt only the vast, echoing absence of a woman who'd shown him what it felt like to want to be better and then proven that wanting wasn't enough. Days passed. Then weeks. Dylan moved through them like a man serving a sentence. He went to work. He attended meetings. He made decisions that kept his organization running. But something essential had been removed from him. The part that had felt alive when Lena was near. The silence between them became the loudest thing in his life. Not the sound of her voice. Not the absence of her touch. But the complete, total, absolute knowledge that he'd lost her and deserved to stay lost. Lena was leaving her apartment building at 6 in the morning to meet a client when the black sedan pulled up beside her. She didn't think anything of it. Chicago had black sedans the way it had winter and indifference. She kept walking. The rear door opened and hands that weren't gentle pulled her inside. She tried to scream. The man beside her put his hand over her mouth and told her that screaming would make this harder than it needed to be. She believed him. She stopped screaming. The warehouse was on the edge of the city where industrial buildings gave way to nothing. The kind of place where people disappeared into concrete and never came back out. They put her in a room with no windows and a single metal table. They didn't restrain her because restraints weren't necessary. Fear was restraint enough. The first man who came to interrogate her was polite. Professional. He introduced himself as Anthony and asked her questions about Dylan's operations like he was conducting a survey. Where did Dylan keep his records? Who were his key associates? What were his plans regarding the Marino family's expansion into the North Shore? Lena didn't answer. She sat at the metal table and told herself that Dylan would come. That this was exactly the kind of thing he'd been designed to handle. That she mattered enough to him that he would move mountains to get her back. Hours passed. Nobody came. The second man was less polite. He didn't introduce himself. He asked the same questions but with an edge of impatience. When she still didn't answer, he left her in the darkness for what felt like forever. Just her and the sound of her own breathing and the terrible knowledge that Dylan's silence might mean something worse than anything they could do to her in this room. On the second day, they brought her food. Pasta that was cold by the time she was supposed to eat it. Water that tasted like rust. A man sat across from her while she ate and told her things about Dylan that made her stomach turn. He used you, the man said conversationally. That's what we do with people like you. We identify them. We insert operatives into their lives. We gather intelligence. You thought you were special. You thought he loved you. But you were always just an asset. A way to get closer to us. Lena tried not to listen. Tried to hold on to the memory of Dylan's hands on her face and the way he told her she was safe. But the man kept talking. We've been watching you for months. We know everything about your meetings. We know about the conversations you reported back to him. We know about the operation he was running against us using you as bait. Lena looked up. Dylan knew about her? Before she was even involved? The man smiled. He understood that he'd found the crack in her armor. He recruited you deliberately, the man said. He identified you as someone with access. Someone smart enough to be useful but isolated enough that you wouldn't have anyone to talk to if things went wrong. And then he sent you into situations where you'd gather intelligence. You were a spy, and you didn't even know it. No, Lena said. The word felt weak. Inadequate. Yes, the man said. And now we're going to use you the same way. We're going to ask you questions. And you're going to answer them. Because if you don't, Dylan gets to choose between you and his business. And we both know what he'll choose. On the third day, they came to tell her that her usefulness had expired. Dylan had made a deal. He was surrendering the territory around the North Shore docks in exchange for her safe release. A territory worth millions. A territory he'd fought wars to control. But here's the thing, the man said as he walked her to the door. He took his time making that decision. He sent teams to find you, sure. But he also sent orders to protect his warehouses. He prioritized the operation. You were secondary. You should know that. You should know that when it came down to choosing between you and his empire, he chose the empire first. He just did it in a way that got him what he wanted in the end. The car ride back to the city felt like moving through someone else's nightmare. Lena sat in the back seat and tried not to believe what they'd told her. Tried to hold on to the possibility that Dylan had done everything he could to get her back immediately. But doubt had taken root. Doubt that had been carefully planted by people who understood how to weaponize truth. Dylan's men brought her to his penthouse. She didn't ask how they'd known where to find her or why they'd been close enough to extract her when the Marino family released her. She just walked through the doors feeling like a ghost moving through the place where she used to exist. Dylan was there. He looked destroyed. His face was haggard. His eyes were red-rimmed. He moved toward her with an expression of such raw relief that Lena almost believed he'd been suffering as much as she had. He tried to pull her into his arms. She stepped back. How long did it take you to arrange the negotiation? She asked quietly. What? How long did you wait before you decided my life was worth surrendering the North Shore docks? Lena, I came immediately. I did everything I could to find you. They didn't tell me where they were holding you. They played games. They made me negotiate from a position of complete uncertainty. But you still chose to prioritize your warehouses first, didn't you? Dylan's expression crumbled. That's not what happened. Isn't it? Lena moved past him toward the window. She looked out at Chicago and felt nothing. No connection. No belonging. Just the vast, hollow recognition that she'd been right all along. That people like Dylan didn't love. They strategized. They calculated. They used people and called it affection. I came for you immediately, Dylan said. The moment I knew you were missing, I mobilized every resource I had. But not before you protected your business interests, Lena said. They told me. They said you sent orders to safeguard your warehouses while you were arranging the negotiation. Dylan moved toward her. They lied to you. That's what they do. They take truth and twist it to break you further. Lena turned to look at him. The man in front of her was the same man who'd told her she was safe. The same man who'd promised to protect her. But she couldn't see the difference between protection and possession anymore. Couldn't see the difference between love and control. I want you to leave, she said flatly. Lena, please. Let me explain. There's nothing to explain. You used me before. I allowed you back into my life despite that, and you used me again. Just in a different way. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep believing that the next time will be different. Dylan reached out. She didn't move, but she didn't reach back either. She just stood there, a woman hollowed out by loss, looking at the man she'd allowed to destroy her twice. When he finally left, she felt nothing. Not relief. Not closure. Just the absolute, certain knowledge that she'd been right to build walls in the first place. The worst part isn't the betrayal. The worst part is that she's right. Because what happens next will test whether Dylan is actually capable of change or if he's just strategizing again. The answer will shock you. If you want to see how this ends, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to reach the breaking point. That every moment of vulnerability she'd ever allowed had been a mistake. That some people were too broken to ever become anything other than what they were. And Dylan Bernard was one of those people. Dylan kept her in the penthouse because he didn't know what else to do. Because leaving her alone felt like abandonment and staying felt like imprisonment. Because he was drowning and she was the only thing that might save him, even though she was actively pushing him underwater. She wouldn't let him touch her. When he tried to hold her hand, she pulled away. When he attempted to sit beside her on the couch, she moved to the other end like his proximity was toxic. She existed in the penthouse like a prisoner who'd accepted her sentence and was serving it with grim acceptance. 3 days after the rescue, Dylan tried again. "The Marino family lied to you," he said. "They do that. They take fragments of truth and construct narratives designed to break people. I came for you immediately. The moment I knew you were missing, I mobilized everything." Lena sat at the window, looking out at the city she'd once felt like she belonged to. She didn't turn to look at him. "Then why did it take so long?" she asked quietly. "It didn't. I moved as fast as I could. They wouldn't tell me where they had you. They played games. They made demands. They—" "Stop," Lena said. "Just stop. I don't want to hear it anymore. I don't want to hear your explanations or your justifications or your carefully constructed versions of events. I want you to understand something, Dylan. I heard what they said. And whether it's completely true or partially true or some twisted version of the truth, it doesn't matter anymore. Because the fact is that you put me in that position in the first place. You used me for intelligence. You turned me into a pawn in a game I didn't know I was playing. And then when I found out, you lied about it. So forgive me if I'm not inclined to believe anything you say about anything ever again." Dylan moved closer. She stood up and walked to the bedroom, closing the door between them. He stood in the living room, separated from her by inches of wood and miles of damage, and understood that he'd broken something that couldn't be fixed with words or promises or presence. That night, he called his brother Marcus. "I need to step back from the organization," Dylan said without preamble. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "What are you talking about?" "I'm handing over my operations. I'm dividing the territory. You take the north side. I'm talking to the others about the south and west. I'm removing myself completely. Dylan, you can't just walk away. The organization needs you. The organization needs to learn how to function without me. I've spent my entire life building an empire on lies and manipulation and the systematic destruction of people who got in my way. And it cost me the only person who ever made me want to be different. It's over." There was another silence. Then Marcus said, "Are you doing this for her?" "I'm doing this because I can't become the man she deserves while I'm still operating in the world that made me into the man I am. I'm doing this because some things are worth more than power. Some people are worth more than empires." Dylan hung up before Marcus could respond. He called his legal team. He called the families that operated under his umbrella. He made calls that dismantled the structure he'd spent 20 years building. By dawn, everyone who needed to know understood that Dylan Bernard was walking away. He didn't feel relief. He felt like he was cutting off his own limbs and hoping that somehow the body could survive without them. When he returned to the bedroom, Lena was awake, staring at the ceiling. "I'm stepping back from the business," he said. "I'm handing over my operations. I'm removing myself from the life that kept me from being the man you need." Lena turned to look at him. For a moment, he thought he saw something flicker across her face. Hope, maybe. Or the ghost of hope. "Why?" she asked. "Because I love you. Because I choose you. Over everything. No conditions. No strategy. Just you. Lena sat up. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts devastation and clarity. You can't fix this by sacrificing your empire, Dylan. That's still strategy. That's still you trying to manipulate the situation into one where I forgive you. Real change isn't about grand gestures. It's about understanding that you fundamentally broke my ability to trust you, and no amount of sacrifice is going to give me that back. Dylan felt something collapse inside his chest. You're saying there's nothing I can do? I'm saying that what you need to understand is that I can't be the reason you change your life. Because if I'm the reason, then one day when things get hard, you'll resent me for it. You'll convince yourself that you sacrificed too much. You'll start building new empires to fill the void. And you'll justify it by telling yourself that it's for us. For our future. But really, you'll be doing what you've always done. Using the people around you to construct the narrative you need to believe about yourself. Dylan moved toward her. Can I at least try? Can I at least prove that I'm willing to be different? Lena looked at him with such profound sadness that it broke him more than anger ever could. You can try, she said quietly. But I can't promise that trying will be enough. I can't promise that I'll be able to forgive you. I can't promise that we'll ever get back what we had. Because the truth is, what we had was built on a lie. And I'm not sure that anything constructed on a foundation of deception can ever be rebuilt into something real. She turned away from him. Dylan stood in the bedroom of his penthouse, surrounded by the evidence of wealth and power that meant absolutely nothing, and understood that he'd finally built something he couldn't destroy his way out of. He'd destroyed himself instead. And somehow, that was the only thing that might actually matter. Lena couldn't sleep knowing what Dylan had done. She couldn't eat. She couldn't work. She moved through the penthouse like a woman haunted by her own guilt, and the irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been the one betrayed. She'd been the one manipulated. Yet somehow she was the one drowning in the knowledge that she destroyed a man's life just by existing. She found him in his office at 3 a.m. He was going through documents, dismantling the empire piece by piece. Each signature was a territory surrendered. Each phone call was a relationship ended. He was systematically erasing himself from the world he'd built, and Lena understood with absolute certainty that this was her fault. Dylan, we need to talk, she said from the doorway. He looked up like he'd been expecting her. Like he'd known she'd come eventually. I can't stay, Lena said. The words came out before she could stop them. Before she could construct them carefully enough to minimize the damage. I can't be the reason you destroy everything. I can't be responsible for you losing your empire, your power, your entire life. Dylan set down his pen. You're not responsible. I am. No, you're not understanding. You did this for me. You walked away because you thought it would make me forgive you. And I can't live with that. One day you're going to resent me. One day you're going to wake up and realize what you gave up, and you're going to hate me for being the reason. Dylan stood up. He moved toward her slowly, like he was approaching something fragile. You're right, he said. You're right that one day I might feel that resentment. You're right that this sacrifice is dangerous and that I'm capable of using it against you. You're right about all of it. But Lena, you need to understand something. I didn't walk away from my empire because of you. I walked away from my empire because of me. Lena shook her head. That's not true. You're rewriting history again. You're constructing a narrative that makes you the hero instead of acknowledging that you hurt me. Come here, Dylan said. He pulled her into the hallway. The penthouse was quiet around them. The city slept below them. It was just the two of them suspended in the space between who they'd been and who they might become. My empire was destroying me, he said quietly. Every deal I made was a lie. Every relationship I built was a weapon. Every moment of my life was spent constructing narratives designed to manipulate people into doing what I wanted. I told myself it was necessary. That power required deception. That love was weakness. That the only way to survive was to never let anyone see the truth. His hand moved to her face. She didn't pull away. And then you walked into my life and showed me what it felt like to want something that wasn't about control. Something that wasn't about power or strategy or winning. You showed me what it felt like to want to be honest. To want to be real. And I couldn't go back. I couldn't pretend that the empire was worth it anymore. Because it wasn't. It was hollow. And I'd spent my entire life building something hollow while the thing that actually mattered was standing right in front of me, and I was using her. Lena felt tears on her face. She couldn't remember starting to cry. I didn't walk away from my empire for you, Dylan continued. I walked away from it because meeting you made me realize that the empire was the thing destroying me. You didn't take my power away, Lena. You helped me understand that the kind of power I had was poison. That the only kind of power worth having is the power to change. To be honest. To love someone without weaponizing that love. But how do I know this is real? Lena asked. How do I know you're not just strategizing again? How do I know this isn't just another manipulation? You don't, Dylan said. That's the terrifying truth. You don't know. You have to choose to trust me anyway. Not because I've earned it. Not because I've proven myself. But because you decide that the risk is worth it. Because you decide that believing in the possibility of change is worth the pain of potential betrayal. Lena looked at him. She saw the man who'd broken her. She saw the man who'd used her. She saw the man who'd lied to her systematically and carefully. But she also saw something else. She saw someone who was finally telling the truth. Someone who was finally acknowledging the damage without trying to minimize it or reframe it. I'm terrified, she said. I know. I'm terrified that I'll trust you and you'll hurt me again. I know. That's the cost of choosing to love someone like me. Of choosing to stay while I try to become someone different. How long will it take? For me to trust you again? I don't know. Maybe forever. Maybe you'll never fully trust me again, and I'll have to spend the rest of my life understanding that I did that to you. Understanding that the price of what I did is that you'll always be waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for me to reveal myself as the monster you know I can be. Lena pressed her forehead against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat. It was fast. Terrified. I need time, she said. I need space to process all of this. I'll give you whatever you need. And I need you to understand that staying doesn't mean I've forgiven you. It means I'm willing to see if forgiveness is possible. It means I'm choosing to believe that people can change, even though I'm not sure I believe that. Dylan held her. Not possessively. Not strategically. Just holding someone who'd been broken and wasn't sure she was going to be able to let him put her back together. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that choice, he said. Lena pulled back and looked at him. Don't promise me forever. Don't promise me redemption. Just promise me that you'll be honest. That you'll tell me when you're struggling. That you won't hide things from me thinking you're protecting me. I promise. And Dylan meant it. He meant it in a way he'd never meant anything before. Not because it would get him what he wanted. But because he'd finally understood that what he wanted was something that could never be strategized into existence. It could only be built, brick by brick, moment by moment, through the absolute dedication to truth. Lena made her decision in the quiet hours of morning when the city was still sleeping and the only sound was her own breathing. She could leave. She could walk out of the penthouse and never look back. She could build the quiet life she'd always wanted, unmarred by Dylan Bernard and everything he represented. It would be the safe choice. The sensible choice. The choice that someone who'd learned at 16 that attachment was dangerous would make. Instead, she chose differently. She found Dylan in the kitchen making coffee. He looked at her with an expression of such careful hope that it broke something open inside her chest. She knew that look. She'd seen it 1,000 times before. But this time, she understood what it meant. It meant he was terrified. It meant he knew he didn't deserve her. It meant he was preparing himself for rejection. "I'm staying," she said. "But we need to be clear about what that means." Dylan set down the coffee. His hands were shaking. "It means we're starting over. This is the moment everything changes. Not because Dylan is redeemed. Not because the past is erased. But because Lena makes a choice that will define both of their lives forever." If you loved watching her fight for someone worth fighting for, subscribe now because we have more stories of dark romance, redemption, and the choice to love someone despite knowing what they're capable of. Lena continued, not from the beginning. Not pretending that what happened didn't happen. But from right now, moving forward, everything requires honesty. Complete honesty. Not strategic honesty. Not honesty designed to manipulate me into forgiving you. But brutal, uncomfortable, inconvenient truth. Every moment. Every conversation. Every feeling. Dylan nodded. "And if you lie to me again," she said, "I'm leaving. Not to give you another chance. Not to see if you can change. I'm leaving and I'm never coming back. Do you understand?" "I understand. And you don't get to use this decision as proof that you've changed. You don't get to point to me staying as evidence of your redemption. You have to do the work. You have to face consequences. You have to become someone different through action, not through my belief in you." "Lena, Let me finish. I'm choosing to stay because I'm strong enough to demand your redemption. Not because I believe you're redeemed. Not because I trust you completely. But because I'm choosing to see if redemption is possible. If you're capable of it. And you don't get to thank me for that. You don't get to be grateful. You just get to do the work." Dylan moved toward her. She held up her hand and he stopped. "We're not there yet," she said. "We're not to the place where you get to touch me like you own me. We're at the place where you prove that you understand the difference between love and possession. Between protection and control." Months passed in the slow, painful work of reconstruction. Dylan negotiated immunity with law enforcement by providing evidence against the organizations he'd done business with. It meant becoming a cooperating witness. It meant facing the reality that every deal he'd made, every relationship he'd built, was a crime waiting to be prosecuted. It meant understanding that the empire he'd constructed was built on the suffering of people he'd systematically destroyed. Lena watched this process with careful eyes. She attended some of his meetings with his lawyer. She listened as he described operations she'd been unknowingly complicit in. She held his hand when the weight of what he'd done threatened to crush him completely. But she also held him accountable. When he had moments of weakness where the old version of himself wanted to resurface, where he wanted to solve problems the way he always had, Lena was there to remind him of what he was choosing instead. Of what they were choosing together. One morning, 6 months after she'd decided to stay, Dylan brought her coffee. It was a small gesture. The kind of simple, domestic thing he never imagined himself doing. He handed it to her with an expression of such vulnerability that Lena almost cried. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "I don't deserve you. I don't deserve the chance to wake up next to you and know that you chose to stay. I don't deserve any of it." Lena sipped the coffee. It was made exactly the way she liked it. Strong. Not too much sugar. A dash of cinnamon. "No, you don't," she said. "But I'm staying anyway because I'm choosing to, not because you convinced me to. That's the difference now. I'm not a pawn in your game. I'm not collateral damage in your empire. I'm here because I decide, every single day, that you're worth the risk. And that's the only difference between now and before. Before, you decided my worth for me. Now, I decide my own worth. And I decide that staying is what's worth it." Dylan sat beside her. They watched the city wake up below them. Chicago coming alive with the sound of traffic and voices and the complicated machinery of millions of people trying to survive together. The penthouse was quiet around them. No strategy being planned. No operations being orchestrated. Just two people sitting together, knowing exactly what the other was capable of and choosing each other anyway. The city didn't care about their story. It would continue humming with indifference whether they stayed together or fell apart. But inside the penthouse, inside this moment, everything was honest. Everything was real. And for the first time since they'd met, Dylan understood that that was more powerful than any empire he could ever build. Lena rested her head on his shoulder. Not because she'd forgiven him completely. Not because she trusted that he wouldn't hurt her again. But because she'd learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was choose vulnerability anyway. Choose to love someone despite knowing they were capable of breaking you. And Dylan, holding her as the sun rose over Chicago, understood that this was the only kind of redemption that mattered. Not the redemption of empire or power or success. But the redemption of being chosen by someone who knew exactly who you were and stayed anyway.